The warm afternoon sun beat down on Maple Street as Walter Jenkins carefully tended to the roses that lined his front yard. At 72 years old, his hands weren't as steady as they once were, but the joy of gardening remained unchanged. Walter hummed an old tune as he worked, his weathered fingers gently pruning each bush with the precision that came from decades of practice. Walter had moved to this neighborhood back when most folks couldn't afford homes in this part of town. That was 1979, and he'd raised his family here, working at the post office for 42 years until retirement. The neighborhood had changed around him, newer houses, younger families, but Walter remained a constant, like the grand oak tree that stood tall in his backyard. "These roses need just a bit more attention," Walter muttered to himself, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat to shield his eyes from the sun. He'd won the local garden competition 3 years running, something that brought him quiet pride. His late wife had started this garden, and tending to it kept her memory alive. Mrs. Thompson from across the street waved as she collected her mail. "Looking beautiful as always, Walter," she called out. Walter straightened his back, wincing slightly at the familiar ache, and waved back with a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The street was peaceful that Tuesday afternoon. Children wouldn't be home from school for another hour, and most folks were still at work. Walter enjoyed these quiet moments alone with his thoughts and his plants. He'd just started trimming a particularly stubborn branch when the sound of tires slowly rolling on asphalt caught his attention. A police cruiser, white with blue stripes, pulled up to the curb outside his house. Walter didn't think much of it at first. Police occasionally patrolled the area, especially since the break-ins at the Johnson place 2 blocks over. He returned to his roses, expecting the car to continue down the street. Instead, the engine shut off. 2 officers stepped out, both wearing crisp uniforms and expressions that made Walter's stomach tighten just a bit. He didn't recognize either of them, which was unusual. Walter knew most of the local officers from his years of community service and neighborhood watch meetings. The taller officer adjusted his belt as he approached, his partner following slightly behind. Neither smiled as they stepped onto Walter's property. "Afternoon," Walter called out politely, putting down his garden shears and removing his gloves. Decades of life had taught him how to navigate moments like these, voice calm, movements slow, hands visible. The officers didn't return his greeting. Instead, the taller one, his nameplate read Brentwood, looked around the property with narrowed eyes before finally addressing Walter. "You working here today?" Officer Brentwood asked, his tone suggesting that Walter couldn't possibly have any other reason to be there. Walter blinked, momentarily confused by the question. "I live here," he replied simply, gesturing toward the house behind him. The 2-story colonial had been featured in a local magazine just last year for its beautiful garden. Walter still had the article framed in his study. The second officer, whose nameplate read Malik, exchanged a glance with his partner. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the area," he said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "You got some ID on you?" Walter felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. Not anger, not exactly. Something more like weary recognition. He'd lived through these moments before, though they seemed to sting just as much at 72 as they had at 22. "My wallet's inside the house," Walter said, pointing toward his front door with soil-stained fingers. "I can go get it for you." As Walter took a step toward his own front door, he noticed both officers tense. Officer Brentwood moved slightly to block his path, and that's when Walter realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. "How about you stay right where you are for now?" Brentwood said, his friendly phrasing at odds with his cold tone. "How long have you been living here exactly?" The emphasis on the word living wasn't lost on Walter. He stood straight, his full height still impressive despite the slight stoop of age, and prepared himself for what was coming. What had started as a perfect afternoon tending to his beloved roses was about to become something very different. Walter stood in his front yard, still holding his garden gloves, as the 2 officers towered over him. The taller one, Officer Brentwood, had positioned himself between Walter and the front door of his own home. "I've lived here since 1979, Walter said calmly, though his heart had begun to beat faster. "That's my house. I own it. Paid it off 20 years ago." Officer Malik raised an eyebrow. "That's so. Must be nice." His tone suggested he didn't believe a word Walter was saying. Like my partner said, we got calls about someone suspicious hanging around these houses. You understand we gotta check these things out. A slight breeze rustled the rose bushes Walter had been tending. The sweet scent that normally brought him joy now seemed lost beneath the heavy tension in the air. I understand you're doing your job, Walter said carefully, but I'm just taking care of my own garden. Ask anybody on this street, they all know me. Officer Brentwood looked around the quiet neighborhood. Most houses were empty this time of day, with folks at work. Mrs. Thompson had gone back inside, and there was no one else in sight to confirm Walter's story. Well, that's convenient, Brentwood said with a smirk. No one around to ask, so let's see some ID. Walter gestured toward his house again. Like I said, my wallet's inside. If you'll just let me go in and get it. You're not going anywhere until we figure out what's what, Brentwood cut him off sharply. For all we know, you could have break-in tools in there. Walter felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice steady. You think I'm breaking into my own home? In broad daylight? While gardening? Officer Malik stepped closer. Watch your tone, old man. We're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. People around here pay good money for these houses. The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Walter had heard comments like this his whole life, the suggestion that he couldn't possibly belong in a nice neighborhood, couldn't possibly own a beautiful home. I worked for the Postal Service for 42 years, Walter said. Raised my kids here. Got grandkids now. This is my home. He pointed to the brass mailbox by the driveway that had Jen Canance engraved on it. That's my name right there. Brentwood barely glanced at it. Anyone can put a name on a box. Doesn't prove anything. Walter noticed Officer Malik's hand was still resting near his holster, a subtle threat that kept Walter rooted to the spot. He'd lived through the civil rights movement, had seen things get ugly fast, and knew better than to make any sudden moves. Look at my garden. Walter tried a different approach. You think someone breaking in stops to prune roses first? Neither officer cracked a smile. We've had reports of lawn service workers casing houses, Malik said flatly. For all we know, that's what you're doing. Walter felt his dignity being stripped away with each accusation. The garden shears he'd been using lay on the ground by the rose bush. Brentwood nudged them with his foot. These could be used as a weapon, he said, as if discovering evidence. Walter almost laughed at the absurdity, but there was nothing funny about what was happening. They're for cutting roses, been using them for years. From across the street, Walter spotted movement. The Patel family's teenage son had come home early from school and was watching the scene unfold with concerned eyes. The boy pulled out his phone, and Walter felt a small surge of hope. Someone was witnessing this. I'm not moving from this spot, Walter said with newfound confidence. This is my property, and I've done nothing wrong. Officer Brentwood stepped even closer, using his height to intimidate. Listen here. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Either you start cooperating or what? Walter asked, his voice stronger now. You'll arrest me for gardening on my own property. Malik's hand moved from near his holster to rest directly on it. We can bring you in for obstruction, resisting. I'm a 72-year-old man standing still in my garden, Walter said. How exactly am I resisting? More neighbors were starting to notice the commotion. The Henderson couple had come onto their porch 2 houses down. Mr. Patel had joined his son at their front window. Brentwood noticed the growing audience and lowered his voice. Last chance. You need to come with us to verify your identity. Walter felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, the special phone his grandson had given him after his heart scare last year. An idea formed in his mind, a way out of this situation that was spiraling out of control. Before we go anywhere, Walter said steadily, I think I should make a call. Walter's hand moved slowly toward his pocket. Officer Brentwood immediately tensed. Keep your hands where I can see them, Brentwood barked, his right hand now fully resting on his holster. I'm just reaching for my phone, Walter explained calmly, though inside his chest, his heart hammered against his ribs. I think we should call my grandson. He can clear this up. Phone stays where it is, Officer Malik said firmly. For all we know, you could be reaching for a weapon. Walter let his hand fall back to his side. 45 years of dealing with situations like this had taught him patience. He'd faced down worse in the 1960s when he was just a teenager marching for his rights. Back then, they'd used dogs and fire hoses. Today, it was just words and intimidation, but the feeling was the same. "I'm not a threat to anyone," Walter said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his knees. "I'm a grandfather, a retired postal worker. I've lived in this house longer than you two have probably been alive." Several neighbors had gathered now. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down had ventured closer, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she watched. The Patel family stood in their driveway across the street. Walter could see Mr. Patel whispering something to his wife, who nodded and disappeared back into the house. Officer Brentwood seemed to notice the growing audience. His posture shifted subtly, still authoritative, but more aware of being watched. "Sir, we're just following protocol," he said, his tone suddenly professional, almost rehearsed. "We receive a call, we check it out. Nothing personal." "Feels pretty personal from where I'm standing," Walter replied evenly. The sun beat down on his neck, and he wished he could reach for his hat that had fallen off during the confrontation. "Being treated like a criminal in my own yard." Officer Malik stepped closer, lowering his voice so the neighbors couldn't hear. "Listen, old man. This neighborhood has changed. Maybe it was different when you moved in, but these houses go for $500,000 now. People get nervous when they see someone who doesn't fit the profile." Walter met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly what you mean by profile, officer, and I know my rights. I've owned this home since before you were born. My late wife planted these roses 20 years ago. Our children learned to ride bikes in this driveway." He gestured toward the weathered basketball hoop above the garage. "My grandson broke that backboard with a slam dunk on his 16th birthday." Walter's mind flashed to his grandson, now a respected attorney with the Justice Department. The thought gave him strength. "I don't need to justify my existence to you or anyone else," Walter continued, his voice gathering power, but never rising above a conversational level. "But I will not be intimidated in my own home." Mrs. Henderson had edged closer. "Walter," she called out. "Everything okay over there? You need anything?" Before Walter could answer, Brentwood turned and flashed what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, ma'am. Just a routine check." "Routine?" Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "I've lived here 12 years and never seen Walter routinely checked while gardening before." Walter appreciated her support but worried about her getting involved. He'd seen situations like this escalate. "It's all right, Louise," he called to her. "Just a misunderstanding." Officer Malik's radio crackled. He turned away slightly to respond, his voice too low for Walter to hear. When he turned back, his expression had changed. "We still need to see some ID," Malik insisted, but his tone had lost some of its edge. Walter noticed more neighbors appearing. Old Mr. Wu, who rarely left his house, was standing on his porch watching. The Campbell kids had stopped their bikes at the corner. Mrs. Patel had returned and was holding her phone up, clearly recording the scene. Walter stood a little straighter. There was a certain power in being witnessed. "Officers," he said with quiet dignity, "I've cooperated fully. I've explained who I am. My neighbors can verify my identity. Yet you continue to detain me in my own yard without cause." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I think it's time I made that call now." Officer Brentwood stepped forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. "I told you." "Not to my grandson," Walter interrupted, his hand slowly moving toward the medical alert device hanging around his neck. The one his daughter had insisted he wear after his mild heart attack last year. To someone else entirely. Walter pressed the button on the device, and a small light began to blink. What the two officers didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that Walter Jenkins was far better prepared for this moment than they realized. 3 months earlier, after a string of break-ins had rattled the neighborhood, Walter's grandson had insisted on installing security cameras around the property. Not just any cameras, Grandpa, his grandson had explained on a Sunday afternoon as he mounted the small devices at strategic points around the house. These record audio too, and they back up to the cloud automatically. Nobody can delete the footage once it's uploaded. Walter had nodded, though at the time he thought it was overkill. His neighborhood had always felt safe to him, despite occasional incidents. But his grandson, with his law background and keen understanding of how the world really worked, had been adamant. Trust me, he'd said, securing the final camera that overlooked the front yard, the exact spot where Walter now stood facing the two officers. These days, evidence is everything. As Officer Brentwood continued to block Walter's path to his own front door, neither officer noticed the small black camera tucked discreetly under the eave of the porch. Its tiny red light blinked steadily, capturing every word, every threatening gesture. "That thing on your neck," Officer Malik said, pointing at the medical alert device Walter had just activated. "What is that?" Walter touched the small pendant. "It's a medical alert. I had a mild heart attack last year. My doctor and my family insisted I wear it." What Walter didn't mention was that his grandson had helped him modify the standard medical alert system. Instead of connecting only to medical services, it had been programmed with 2 additional emergency contacts: his grandson and a longtime friend who served as a captain in the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Officer Brentwood scoffed. "So what, you having a medical emergency now? Convenient timing." "No emergency," Walter said calmly. "But this device does more than call ambulances. It records conversations. And it just sent an alert, along with our GPS location, to some people who might be very interested in how you're treating me right now." This wasn't entirely true. The device didn't record audio, but the cameras certainly did. Walter had learned long ago that sometimes you needed to use whatever leverage you had. The officers exchanged glances. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across their faces. "You're bluffing," Malik said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Walter gestured toward the growing number of neighbors watching. Mrs. Patel was still holding up her phone, clearly recording. Mr. Wu had ventured off his porch and was standing at the edge of Walter's property. "And even if I am, there are plenty of witnesses here now." Officer Brentwood squared his shoulders, doubling down. "Doesn't matter who's watching. We received a call about suspicious activity, and we're investigating. That's our job." "And who made this call?" Walter asked, his voice stronger now. "I'd like to know which of my neighbors reported me for gardening in my own yard." Brentwood's jaw tightened. "We don't have to share that information." Walter noticed Mrs. Henderson watching with narrowed eyes. She'd been a neighborhood watch coordinator for years and knew everyone on the block. "Louise," Walter called out to her. "Did you see anyone suspicious around here today? Besides these officers, I mean." Mrs. Henderson stepped closer. "Not a soul, Walter. Place has been quiet as can be all day." Officer Malik shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Ma'am, please stay back. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," she replied firmly. "When you harass my neighbor of 12 years, a man who shoveled my walkway last winter when my arthritis was acting up, it very much concerns me." More neighbors were gathering now. The Campbells had parked their bikes and moved closer. The Patels had been joined by the Rodriguezes from next door. Walter felt a swell of gratitude for this community he'd helped build over decades. Meanwhile, the light on his medical alert device had stopped blinking and turned solid green, indicating that someone had received his alert and was responding. Walter smiled slightly, knowing what was coming. His grandson had insisted on testing the system when they set it up. 7 minutes, he told Walter. "That's the average response time when I get an alert. And I drop everything when it's you, Grandpa." Exactly 6 minutes had passed since Walter had pressed that button. As if on cue, Walter's phone began to ring in his pocket. Officer Brentwood tensed again. "I need to answer this," Walter said, his voice calm but firm. "It's important." "Don't move," Brentwood warned, but there was a new uncertainty in his voice. Walter's phone continued to ring, the sound cutting through the tense silence of the front yard. Walter's phone continued to ring. The sound seemed to grow louder with each passing second, cutting through the tense silence in the front yard. "I'm going to answer this," Walter said calmly, his eyes never leaving Officer Brentwood's face. "It's my grandson, the one I mentioned earlier." "I said don't move," Brentwood repeated, but his voice had lost its edge. The growing crowd of neighbors and the blinking cameras had changed the atmosphere considerably. Walter slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen showed a photo of his grandson in a suit, standing on the steps of a federal courthouse. Walter held the phone up so both officers could see who was calling. "My grandson," Walter said simply. "He works for the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division." Officer Malik's expression changed instantly. He took a half step back and glanced at his partner. Walter answered the phone and put it on speaker. "Hello there," he said, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through his body. "Grandpa, are you okay? I got the alert from your medical device." His grandson's voice came through clear and professional. "What's happening?" "I'm fine physically," Walter replied. "But I've got 2 police officers here questioning me in my own front yard. They seem to think I'm trespassing at my own home." There was a brief pause before his grandson spoke again, his tone shifting from concerned to authoritative. "Could you please put me on speaker so I can speak with the officers?" "Already done," Walter said. "Officers, my name is Thomas Jenkins. I'm an attorney with the DOJ Civil Rights Division. I'm concerned about what appears to be happening to my grandfather. Could one of you identify yourself, please?" Officer Brentwood straightened his posture, professional training kicking in. "This is Officer James Brentwood, badge number 4872. And Officer Michael Malik, badge number 5136, added the second officer, his earlier aggression now completely gone. "Thank you," Thomas said. "Now, can either of you explain why you're detaining my 72-year-old grandfather on his own property without cause?" Brentwood cleared his throat. "We received a call about a suspicious person." "What was suspicious about him?" Thomas interrupted. "The caller said," Brentwood began, but Thomas cut him off again. "Let me be clear," Thomas's voice was sharp as a razor. "Are you telling me someone called because they saw an elderly black man gardening in a nice neighborhood, and without any evidence of wrongdoing, you decided to detain him and prevent him from entering his own home to get identification?" The silence that followed was deafening. "I'm currently looking at the security camera feed from my grandfather's property," Thomas continued. "I can see everything that's happened for the past 20 minutes. I can hear everything that's been said." Walter watched as both officers' eyes darted up to the house, searching for the cameras they'd failed to notice earlier. "Furthermore," Thomas added, "I'm on another line with Captain Rivera from your Internal Affairs Division. He's quite interested in this situation." As if summoned by the words, a new police cruiser turned onto the street, moving at a deliberate pace toward Walter's house. This one had supervisor markings on its side. "I want to be absolutely clear," Thomas said, his voice echoing from the phone speaker for all the neighbors to hear. "What's happening right now appears to be a textbook case of racial profiling and civil rights violation. My grandfather has been a homeowner at this address since 1979. He's a respected member of the community, a retired federal employee, and he was simply tending his garden when you approached him." The supervisor's cruiser pulled up behind the officer's car. A tall woman in a captain's uniform stepped out, her expression stern as she assessed the scene. 2 officers, an elderly man with a phone, and at least a dozen neighbors watching from various positions around the yard. "Listen," Officer Malik said quickly, his voice lowered. "This has all been a misunderstanding." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Walter replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And so does everyone watching. So does my grandson. So will Captain Rivera when she sees the video footage." The captain approached with measured steps. "Officers, what's the situation here?" Before either could answer, Walter's grandson spoke through the phone again. "Captain Rivera, thank you for responding so quickly. This is Thomas Jenkins, DOJ Civil Rights Division. I believe your officers have been detaining my grandfather without cause on his own property. We have the entire incident on video, including some concerning comments about racial profiles and suggestions that my grandfather couldn't possibly belong in this neighborhood." The captain's expression darkened as she turned to face her officers. "Is that true?" Brentwood and Malik exchanged glances. The crowd of neighbors waited, watching justice unfold in real time in Walter Jenkins' front yard. The front yard fell silent as Captain Rivera fixed her gaze on officers Brentwood and Malik. Her arms crossed over her chest, and her expression made it clear she wanted answers. "Now." "Well?" she prompted when neither officer immediately responded. Officer Brentwood straightened his back. "Captain, we responded to a call about a suspicious person. We were just following protocol. By preventing a homeowner from entering his own house to get his ID." Captain Rivera cut him off sharply. She turned to Walter. "Sir, I apologize for this situation. I'm Captain Rivera, head of this precinct." Walter nodded, still holding the phone where his grandson was listening. Walter Jenkins. I've owned this home for over 40 years. Grandpa, Thomas's voice came through the speaker. I'm sending Captain Rivera the security footage now. I've also contacted her superior, Chief Wilson. He's an old friend from law school. Captain Rivera's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and frowned deeply. I've received the footage link. Officers, wait by your vehicle while I review this. Her tone left no room for argument. As Brentwood and Malik retreated to their patrol car, muttering to each other, the captain stepped aside to watch the video on her phone. Walter could see her expression darkening with each passing moment. Nearby, the neighbors continued to watch, some filming with their phones, others whispering among themselves. Mrs. Henderson approached Walter, concern etched on her face. Walter, can I get you some water? You've been standing in this heat for nearly an hour. That would be kind, Louise, Walter replied with a grateful smile. His legs ached from standing so long, and his mouth felt dry from the tension of the confrontation. As Mrs. Henderson hurried back to her house, Mr. Patel stepped forward. Walter, my wife has called the local news. They're sending someone. This needs to be seen. Walter nodded, though part of him wished for privacy. He'd never sought attention or trouble. All he'd wanted today was to tend his roses in peace. Now his front yard had become an impromptu community gathering, with more neighbors arriving by the minute as word spread through text messages and phone calls. Thomas, Walter spoke into the phone. What happens now? Those officers will face immediate consequences, his grandson replied, his voice firm but reassuring. The footage shows clear misconduct. Captain Rivera seems like a good officer. She responded right away when I contacted her. That's a good sign. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a woman in a crisp suit stepped out, legal briefcase in hand. She surveyed the scene with practiced eyes before making her way directly to Walter. Mr. Jenkins? I'm Patricia Washington, attorney with the ACLU. Your grandson contacted our office. I was already in the area for a different case. She held out her hand, which Walter shook firmly. We take incidents like this very seriously. Captain Rivera finished watching the video and rejoined the group, her face set in grim lines. Mr. Jenkins, on behalf of the department, I want to formally apologize for what's happened here today. She glanced toward her officers, who stood uncomfortably by their patrol car. Their actions were completely unacceptable and do not represent how we train our officers to conduct themselves. What happens to them? Walter asked, not out of vengeance but genuine curiosity about the consequences. Effective immediately, they're suspended pending a full investigation, the captain said without hesitation. Based on what I've seen in that footage, I expect more serious disciplinary action will follow. There will also be a formal review of all their previous interactions and arrests. Patricia Washington nodded approvingly. We'll be monitoring that investigation closely, Captain. From his phone, Thomas spoke up again. Grandpa, I've also contacted the mayor's office. This isn't the first complaint about these officers. The mayor wants to speak with you personally. Walter felt overwhelmed by the sudden flurry of attention and support. Just an hour ago, he'd been a man alone, facing two intimidating officers who made him feel like a criminal in his own yard. Now he stood surrounded by neighbors, legal support, and the weight of authority shifting to his side. As Mrs. Henderson returned with a glass of cold water, a news van pulled up to the curb. A reporter and cameraman quickly set up, preparing to broadcast what had happened. Captain Rivera turned to Walter once more. Mr. Jenkins, would you be willing to come to the station to give a formal statement? Not now, whenever is convenient for you. Ms. Washington can accompany you, of course. 3 months later, Walter sat on his front porch, a glass of iced tea sweating on the small table beside his rocking chair. His roses were in full bloom now, their sweet scent filling the warm summer air. From this spot, he could see most of the neighborhood, the same view he had enjoyed for over 40 years. But much had changed since that day in his front yard. The story had spread quickly, first locally, then nationally. The security camera footage, clear and damning, had been viewed millions of times online. Walter's calm dignity in the face of harassment had struck a chord with people across the country. He'd received hundreds of letters from strangers thanking him for standing his ground, for showing what quiet courage looked like. Mind if I join you? A voice called from the sidewalk. Walter smiled at the sight of Captain Rivera approaching his house. Please do. Iced tea. That would be wonderful, she said, climbing the steps to the porch. She was in casual clothes today. This wasn't an official visit. As Walter poured her a glass, she settled into the chair next to his. The department vote was unanimous, she said without preamble. Both officers have been terminated. Permanently. Walter nodded slowly. He felt no joy at the news, just a quiet satisfaction that accountability had prevailed. And the other changes we discussed? Captain Rivera smiled. That's the better news. The new training program starts next month. Every officer in the department will go through it. And you know what? Several other police departments from neighboring counties have asked if they can send their people too. After the incident, Walter had been invited to meet with the police commissioner and the mayor. Instead of simply accepting their apologies, he had come prepared with thoughtful suggestions for reform. His grandson Thomas had helped him draft a proposal for community police relations and anti-bias training. Will you still speak at the first session? Captain Rivera asked. I will, Walter confirmed. I never wanted those officers to lose their jobs, you know. I wanted them to learn and do better. I know, she said. That's why people respect you so much. Down the street, Walter could see Mrs. Henderson hanging flowers on her porch. The neighborhood had changed too. What had begun as neighbors witnessing an injustice had blossomed into something more, a true community. They'd started a neighborhood association with Walter as its honorary president. Monthly block parties brought everyone together, bridging divides of age, background, and culture. Oh, before I forget, Captain Rivera reached into her bag and pulled out a newspaper. You made the front page again. Walter chuckled as he took the paper. There he was, standing alongside the mayor and police commissioner at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community outreach center. The building had been named after him, the Jenkins Center for Community Justice. Your grandson is making waves too, she added. I hear the Attorney General has personally commended his work on police reform. Walter's chest swelled with pride. Thomas had always been brilliant, but the incident had ignited a new passion in him. He'd been appointed to lead a special task force on community policing and civil rights protections. The sound of children laughing drew Walter's attention to the street where the Patel kids and the Rodriguez children were riding bikes together. Their parents sat chatting on the Rodriguez porch across the way, waving when they noticed Walter looking. You know what's remarkable? Walter said softly. All this good coming from such an ugly moment. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Great news, Grandpa. The governor just signed the bill. The Walter Jenkins Act is now law. Walter showed the message to Captain Rivera, who broke into a wide smile. The new legislation required all police departments in the state to implement body cameras, anti-bias training, and community oversight boards. Your legacy, she said simply. Walter shook his head. Not mine alone. Everyone who stood up that day shares in this. As the evening sun cast long shadows across his front yard, the same yard where he'd been harassed for gardening while black, Walter felt a deep sense of peace. He'd lived long enough to see many changes, both good and bad. He'd experienced discrimination and injustice throughout his life. But he'd also seen the power of community, the impact of standing firm with dignity, and now the possibility of real change. The roses his late wife had planted decades ago continued to bloom season after season. And now something new was blooming too, hope for a world where his grandchildren and their children might someday tend their gardens without fear. More tea? Walter offered, lifting the pitcher. I'd like that, Captain Rivera replied, holding out her glass. Here's to many more peaceful afternoons on this porch. Walter smiled as he poured. To peace, he agreed. And to justice.